Hi, everybody. This is my first time at XP conference, actually my first time at a mixed conference like this of academics and industry practitioners. So I find it really interesting. Already learned a lot yesterday, and thanks a lot, Sibylle and Martin, for inviting me. And as Sibylle said, so I have a full-time role right now at ThoughtWorks to just like every day look into what AI means for software teams, and specifically in the sense of using AI as a tool on the teams to, hopefully improve software delivery. So as opposed to, building applications that are backed by an LLM, which I always see as like two quite different things. I have a bit of like a bar chart here as well. I learned the term literature review yesterday, which I didn't know about yet. I learned that at lunch. So this is not quite as like disciplined as a literature review. I don't know, you might not be able to see the labels at the bottom, but this is basically an internal spreadsheet that I maintain where I drop like all of the tools I hear about, like that you can use for coding, for requirements analysis, for design, for all of those different things. And then I tag them with the different kind of task areas that we have, right? So it's like analysis, architecture, coding, design, documentation. It's sometimes even hard to categorize, and I sometimes tag them with multiple. And so when I took the screenshot 2 days ago, I was tracking 147 tools. I think this morning I already saw 2 more that I will have to add later. And the biggest bar that you see here is for coding. And you might say, I'm a developer, so I might be biased. I might be, particularly looking at coding tools, but I really think from what I see that this is an accurate representation of what's going on in the tools market, and also what's going on in companies in terms of what they focus on at the moment when they look at generative AI assistants. By the way, I'm always talking about generative AI when I say AI. So I think the train has left the station. We've all started saying AI when we mean Gen AI, right? So I just want to say that from the start. Yeah. So the most activity is happening in the coding space, right? So a lot of our clients also, when the ones that have started adopting Gen AI to improve their teams, it's like the vast majority is mainly coding. And often then it's like, oh, here's a coding assistant, go and, get faster, right? So testing is the second highest bar here. I think it's also like a lot of coding tools you can already help with, that already helps you with a lot of testing as well, right? So it's like very focused on this kind of like development part and maybe some testing. And so here you see like an older representation were kind of like the main coding assistants I saw at the time. It was 10 or so of them. At this point in the spreadsheet, I think I have like 20, 30 coding assistants. They still pop up all over the place, like different products there. And then, of course, the frequently asked question that we hear from our clients the most is, how much faster does AI make the team? Actually, what they ask is, what is the impact on productivity? But usually what they mean is, how much faster does it make people? And so what I started using like a year ago or so was kind of like a heuristic for me to just think about the ballpark of this, because as probably most of you know, as agile practitioners, measuring this is really hard, right? So, but I wanted to at least have like a ballpark and a way to have conversations with people about, is this 50% faster? What does this actually mean, right? So this is like kind of like a scenario. If you think about how much of cycle time does a team actually spend on coding, right? Like using cycle time here is one of the best proxy variables that we have. So let's say it's 40%, which is actually quite high, right? And then when you look at like which part of the coding is actually supportable with the coding assistant, that can vary per team, right? So it depends on the tech stack that they use, how complex the problem is that they work on, and so on. So let's say 60% of the cases, the coding assistant is actually usable for them. And then whenever they use it, they are 55% faster. That would mean if we multiply these percentages, I hope, for the academics and researchers in the room, I've done this the right way. So when you multiply this, you would get like an impact of 13% on cycle time for this kind of very optimistic scenario, right? So I use this to have conversations with people, also to remind them that coding is not all that we do, and and there's like so much else going on, just to give them a ballpark. And so that's also what I've seen in reality. Like when I've talked to teams that have tried to do some estimation or measuring of like how much faster they think they are, it's usually between 5 and 10%. It's like no surprise that then companies say, oh, we don't see the impact, because if you think about the the cycle time charts in teams, the control charts, right? Like there's usually quite a bit of variance, right? So you might not even see 5 to 10%, but at the same time, the tools cost you less than 0.01% of what your team costs you, right? So there's like, but that's kind of like the conversation about the ballpark. So, but these numbers were kind of like from last year, and last year was when I was still quite comfortable with these numbers and what I was seeing out there. But then we got like a new step change in the coding assistance, which was kind of like about agentic modes, right? So now I actually, sit like this, I have tense shoulders, I like to stretch, and I see the assistant go and like look up the SDK, research on the web, update the tests, update the code, fix linting errors that arose from the changes, run the tests. So it's doing like a lot more stuff automatically while I kind of still supervise and intervene. So, and now with this, I actually think like, again, mileage varies and it depends on the team and the circumstances. But with this, in a lot of cases, you can actually like pull up this 55% faster task completion quite a bit, especially when it's like new code or particular tech stacks, simple problems. So this again, like kind of shifts these numbers now. So you might be wondering, the title of the keynote is to talk about beyond coding, and all I've done so far is talk about coding, but that will be all of that, right? So I'll not talk much more about it today, but I do elsewhere. So there's like a space on Martin Fowler's website where me and also some of my colleagues share kind of like things that we see as they kind of like come along. And maybe just as two examples, like two memos, as we call them, that came out recently that I think are quite interesting. Is like one, I talked about like the different missteps that I see AI make where I have to intervene, where I take my hands off my neck and actually say, no, that's not what you do, and what that might mean for our developer skills. And I also quite like this one by my colleagues, Jim and Lily, who talked about the new risks for the software supply chain that now we have to face with agents that just like loop on our machine and constantly change stuff. So this was all about coding and its impact on cycle time. But of course, as you all know, there's like a lot more that we do, right? So I use lead time here. There's lots of definitions as the definition of all activities to bring one feature live and how long does it take, right? So there's like some coding involved there as well, of course, but there's lots of things not even related to a specific feature that we do that don't even show up in cycle time, right? So there's all of these other things that we do in software teams. So what I want to do now is like first, like just bombard you with a whole bunch of examples. And this is actually super important in generative AI, is sharing stories with each other, because we can't have a manual like this is exactly how you use it, because we can't open the hood and look into the engine, what we usually do with technologies, right? We're like, yeah, okay, it puts it on the queue and then this happens, right? With this, we can't, right? Even the creators of the large language models don't really fully understand why some of these interesting properties emerge, right? So sharing stories with each other is super important, because it's kind of like this huge Swiss Army knife that you have to, as a practitioner, kind of learn to recognize when you should reach for it, right? Because you can use it for all kinds of stuff. So I'll give you a bunch of examples to maybe inspire you to think of other examples that might be relevant in your context. And then the second part will be more the hand-wavy part, where I reflect a little bit about the big picture, what this means holistically for teams. So let's start with at the front, let's say, with ideation. So I think this is still not talked about enough, using Gen AI for ideation, for more divergent thinking, right? Because it can give you all kinds of like new ideas and help you with more nonlinear thinking and finding unexpected connections. So here's an example. Never mind the details what's on the slide, right? But I was just thinking about like a product challenge or goal, right? Like, let's say I'm building a product for EV charging stations, and I'm thinking about, what does this mean if we have more and more elderly users? What should we think about, right? So I get a bunch of ideas, and then usually what's happening is like, by far not all of the ideas actually make sense, right? So maybe I get something that's already happening, something where I'm like, that's very unlikely, and something that kind of makes me curious, not even maybe the specific thing, but it gives me yet another new idea, right? And you can apply this type of thing to a lot of things, right? Like you can also think about this in architecture context, right? And then you have to expect that a lot of the things that you get will not be relevant, but that doesn't mean that it's not a useful tool, right? So it's just yet another example of how it augments the human, and then you have to filter that. So this was like a very high level example, but let's take something a bit more concrete. Like, let's say you have an existing application and you actually want to think about like how you can improve certain parts of it. And with existing applications, it's kind of the same challenge that we have with coding assistants, that when we change code, it's actually harder than when we build something from scratch. Because when we change something, there's a lot of pre-existing context that we have to feed to the AI first, so it can give us helpful context. And so this example is like one where I actually had AI browse through the application itself. So I didn't have to like describe everything that we already have. So this is an open source CRM where here's just like browsing through, and I asked it like, I want to improve collaboration, and it's looking at like some of the existing features and then making suggestions, some ideas of what I could do with this. And then an additional thing in ideation that really helps. So, I mean, you might have this problem as well when you use Gen AI, you get a wall of text and then you have to read it, right? You have to understand what does this actually mean. So when you use this then in combination with like some of the rapid prototyping tools that are there, it actually helps you process a lot more what the ideas are, because visually you can see it a lot better, right? Like, so on this kind of like prototypey screenshot, I could see, it's suggesting to have comments on these things, and it's suggesting a grouping and rating. So it helps me as a human like process much better what all of these suggestions are. So, and in this context, ideation with Gen AI, so humans still need to provide kind of some creative constraints and context, right? But also this creative constraints, like if you just ask like a one sentence, like very open question, you'll just get the defaults from the training data, and it's not very interesting. And your competitors can do that as well, right? So there's still a bit of this in like, how do I actually set this up and give like my particular parameters to get like good ideas out of it? And then another thing I've noticed is that when you do this type of ideation and brainstorming in context, and like I did it on a team with threat modeling once, for example, to have it brainstorm threat scenarios for our application. And then we got like 20 ideas. And then as a team, we went through and we discussed every single one of them, which took a lot of our time, right? So it would have been a lot more efficient if we had just like maybe pre-voted quickly in 5 minutes, like which ones should we even discuss? Because you get like a lot of stuff that can then lead you to waste a lot of time by discussing all of the bad ideas as well, right? So throughout this, I'll give you a bit of an overview of like different tool archetypes that I see right now for an AI-enabled engineering organization. And what we see mostly here was kind of the AI chat, right? So in my example, I was using Claude. So this is definitely at the core of what an organization should have if they want to enable their teams with Gen AI. And then this chat you saw with my like browsing integration. So this somehow should be integrated with the different knowledge sources in the organization, right? So we saw the browser here. The wiki is a very common source of like getting context for what already exists as well, of course. And these days, in terms of technology, like MCP, like the Model Context Protocol, has been really exploding recently, and is enabling a lot of this ecosystem to actually plug these things together. And then also another archetype that was kind of used here is this application type of like, recently I had a discussion of like what to actually call this. So I landed on rapid application generation for now, which are kind of tools like Lovable, Bold, V0, where you give a prompt and they actually like generate like a whole application for you that is even runnable. So I wouldn't recommend putting that code into production, but it's like a really good way of like getting quick visualization, like I showed you before, to process this easier, and also for like product owners to bring across what they're actually talking about, or designers even without building a design. And it comes like with inbuilt test data generation, right? That's also really great. Like sometimes I go and say, hey, what if some of these texts are longer, or like what will it look like then, right? And it gives you really good test data that can also give you new ideas for your domain. So speaking of design, in this phase, I want to give you some examples from a real project. At ThoughtWorks, we've been maintaining this medical health record system for quite a while called BAMNI that is built on top of OpenMRS, which is also an open source basis for that. And so this is a code base that is also partially open source. And so there's like a lot of history about how this evolved, and like it's really high time that they modernize the UI, not only in terms of the tech, but also in terms of like the user experience and all of that. So we've had a team kind of like go all out with AI across all of these things as part of their modernization project. So this is the existing UI. And the designer who worked on this like tried like different things. So this was one thing she did, like a kind of like a design audit of the existing UI. So she took screenshots of it. Then she used an AI tool to turn the screenshots into Figma designs. And then Figma has like a bunch of like interesting plugins and extensions now that can then help you like do, in this case, like an audit of this design. So it noted things here like you should minimize nested accordions to improve information accessibility and avoid excessive clicking, or you should improve the color contrast. And Gen AI usually also gives you recommendations of how to fix it, not just like this is bad, but also suggestions. And she, like the designer working on this, she thought it looked quite promising, gave her a great head start. And for her also as a consultant, she found it particularly interesting because when she gets like sent to a new organization, that's often her job in the first, like give them feedback for what they have, right? So she was like, oh, this really helps me get started. That's, of course, another question, right? Are consultants getting replaced by Gen AI? But that's for another conversation. Then another thing they did, this is like a very commonly mentioned use case, I think, is research synthesis, right? So they had user interviews and then kind of like synthesize that into like observations, user needs, pain points. This layout was created by a human, but the content came from Gen AI. And in this case, they also had older on-site research from like 5 or 6 years ago. So this is basically the installed, for example, in like rural hospitals in India in this case. And so they had all of this like a big PDF document, including pictures and all of that from this on-site research from a few years ago. And they fed this to Gen AI and said, based on this, can you draft key user archetypes, jobs to be done, user journeys? And from the pictures, it could actually like pick up on some of the patient journey things, right? Like how they queue up outside and how there were different categories of patients and some stuff of that. So it avoids some of the waste of relearning, right? But still, they had to like review and heavily edit this with the domain subject matter expert, with the doctor that they're actually working with. Then next, they kind of took all of those things and fed them into, this is like a Figma plugin called Coco, spelled with Q, with 2 Qs. And so this one creates synthetic users, a very contentious practice among designers and researchers, because, of course, you should talk to real users, right? But sometimes it might still be a good starting point for you to get like a baseline in the beginning, especially when it's a very common domain, right? So with this plugin, they kind of got personas with tasks and activities and challenges and pain points. And then they could actually have a conversation with this persona, right? So that's the idea of the synthetic users, that you try to have Gen AI simulate what a person with these characteristics might answer. So this helped them like generate flowcharts for each patient type and so on. So they really went through all of this. So some learnings from that. Pranjal, the designer, said that she got much faster domain context, and this helped her deepen her domain vocabulary much faster. It unburdened the subject matter expert quite a bit, the doctor. So he said that whatever she came with to him to have the conversations after she had done stuff with AI, he said it was kind of 50% there, and he just didn't have to explain everything from scratch again, right? So he found it like really big relief. And Pranjal also said it helped her think out of the box, because this was an existing application that she needed to come up with ideas to modernize it. But when you have an existing application, you're kind of anchored to what it already is, right? So it helped her think out of the box. But also user experience design is much more than visuals of individual screens, right? So she was sometimes missing a little bit like the, with the design audit, right? She wanted an audit of the user journey, not just of the individual screens. And also, of course, prototypes don't fully replace high fidelity design, right? Like when you do this rapid application generation, it doesn't replace that. And also, too many ideas can lead to actually delays and lack of clarity on the team. So they actually found, because they were using so many of these things, they kind of got lost in all of the many variations that they got. So, but that adds a new kind of tool to our blueprint of archetypes, right? Which is these design assistants. So, and because like the main tool that a lot of designers use these days is Figma, like Figma is definitely a core part of this, but it has this plugin system. So there's a lot of plugins there as well that you can use on top of the built-in features. There's also a tool called UX Pilot or Creati that a lot of designers and thoughts have used and tried, and there's more in the spreadsheet. Okay, next let's go to specification or requirements engineering. So once you actually know what to do, how do you tell the developers, right? So I'll just give you this like little story of like where I was trying to break down requirements into stories, and a lot of the typical things happened that happen to me almost all the time when I do this. So basically this is Claude, and I asked it to kind of give me an order as well. So it created foundational stories, enhancements, advanced. It was kind of like nice categorization. Then I asked it, you know, give me more details, please. Then I asked it to create an artifact. So let me see if I can stop this real quick. This is a feature in some AI chats also called Canvas. So this is when you kind of get like an often editable document on the side, right? And it's almost like a coding assistant, but for like non-coders, because you like AI edits the document, but you can also edit it. And then you can ask it AI again to edit something, right? And it's a lot more tedious if AI is the only owner of the artifact. So this is like for me also a core feature for all of this knowledge work and software, that you have a chat that does this. So I used Claude here, and Claude, it's actually not editable yet, but you know, it's like, so you kind of, at the moment, all the features are evolving. You kind of have to look at what the providers have there. Then another typical thing that happened here to me was that it comes up with work packages that are only technical. So it will say, here's a story for the persistence layer. Here's a story for building the front end, right? So it's really hard to get it to do vertical slicing. Another typical thing is, you know, size, like too big, break it down further. So this was like the conversation that I was having here. And of course, in terms of integration, you can then still, once you're happy with the stories, you can again integrate with Jira or something like that and say, now create the stories in Jira for me, right? So it's this kind of like story breakdown, requirements breakdown thing is like a great starting point, especially for commonplace domains, right? It's the same as with tech stacks. Like if you're working on an e-commerce application and you're like working on specifying the cart checkout, right? Like that, the large language models know about this domain, right? So it gives you a great starting point. But if you have something more unusual or more out there, then I've talked to one of our teams who has like quite an unusual and complex domain, and they had to feed AI with a lot of context for it to actually help them. Like I said, it often goes too broad too quickly, and it's hard to get it to slice thinly and vertically. And there's also kind of like the risk of scope creep, right? Like when you're maybe a less experienced requirements engineer, it gives you all of these ideas. This is what you should do. This is also what you should do. And you're not used to like keeping it tight, right? Then this can actually lead to scope creep. Like some of these things, like this is often going too broad too quickly, and we don't want technical work packages. Like some of this you can try and have AI reflect on again as well, right? So there's this thing where, so AI cannot think silently, right? Like it always needs to produce tokens. So sometimes it's good to have like a two-step thing where you let it do the first draft first, and then you do another step where you give it like the criteria of like, look at this again and review it, and you know, and then it will actually say, oh yeah, you're right, right? So that's because it has to like have some tokens first that it can review, if that makes sense, right? So here's like a prompt that I've used in this like second step about the work packages, right? So does it create value for an end user? Is it a vertical slice? So those first two are kind of ambiguous still, right? So they're a bit hit and miss because you have to know what that actually means. But the other ones were a bit more concrete, right? Is it purely about technical setup? Is it purely about a cross-functional concern? Any testing or quality assurance should never be a separate work package. So I get that all the time as well, a story that is just about QA, right? So with some of these things, when you have concrete criteria, you can actually prompt it again and make that better. And it's a great way to reflect on what you actually want, right? And it might actually even help more junior people understand what good practices are. And speaking of that, what I also really like is having I play kind of like a teammates role. And so this is like an internal kind of experiment where you feed it a story and then it asks you questions about the story, pretending to be the developer. And it also suggests answers to it, but then I can edit those and I can remove some questions that are not relevant and then generate the story based on that. So it can kind of help you find gaps like what you hadn't thought about yet. So you often get questions about like validation rules, mandatory fields, should the button always be visible on the page or not, right? So those are sometimes things that you might not have thought about yet. But again, could be scope creep as well, right? If we get all of these ideas. So it can help us get more comprehensive scenarios and fill gaps in our thinking, but more details isn't always better. And so the new tools in this like blueprint is kind of like Canvas support in the chat. It's like super helpful, right? This like a Canvas artifact support, and image and diagram generation support can also really help here, right? So like you can have like user flow diagrams or something like that, again, to process more what you see. And we also saw here like the integration with an issue tracker. So as the last category of examples, before I get to the hand waving, so this is an example from the architecture space, but it's actually on a meta level more to dive deeper into using AI for knowledge and practice amplification. So I already hinted at it just now with the criteria for what is a good work package, right? Where actually just by writing down the prompt, you're also creating really great documentation of, you know, what you actually need. So because I like Gen AI the most, like when I can find ways to help me think, not just to generate an artifact. So what we usually do is like there's some like methodologies and practices out there and we kind of have to know them. They're kind of the tools in our toolbox. And then we have a problem at hand. And so we have to understand the methodologies and know them and then kind of like apply this like to our problem at hand, right? And often that means reading an article with an example that is not quite like ours. And then we have to figure out like, how does it apply to what I'm doing? So, you know, like either I can go and first of all, I can go and ask the large language model for methodologies and practices that I might not know about yet, right? And then I can also ask it to apply that to my situation when I give it context. So that can actually help me learn a practice much faster and understand how it relates. So to go back to the threat modeling that I mentioned before, that's a very daunting practice for a lot of teams because it's also security related, which is always scary. And then you have to read this like long article by my colleague on Martin Fowler's website, and then you have to understand that. But you can also like have a good prompt written by an expert in threat modeling that helps you get examples in your particular context, right? Here's another example. Like here I was asking Claude, what are good models of thinking for like assessing the strengths and weaknesses of my architecture? And then I picked one of them. In this case, I think it was like a trade-off analysis method. And I said, oh, what would that look like for this current problem that I'm assessing, where I'm trying to find out, is this a good idea or a bad idea? So yeah, it's this idea that you have a reusable prompt and then you feed it with your problem at hand. So to give yet another example here, in our like internal prompt library in ThoughtWorks, we have one for architecture decision records. Like I've seen so many bad architecture decision records out there. And my colleague Andrew Hamel-Law just wrote a book, Facilitating Software Architecture, that in part also is about good decision records. And so I sat down with him and like asked him, you know, for pitfalls, good practices and all of that. And we wrote a prompt together that you can now feed like with like your draft of your decision record, and it helps you improve it, right? So the prompt contains stuff like the title should always specify the decision that was taken, not the problem that is solved. So that is a very common pitfall. Or each option should have a section called consequences that describes the trade-offs, positive and negative consequences, right? Or also one that I really like is that's one of Andrew's things, like one of the options considered in the record should always be do nothing. So this type of thing that it can kind of point you at. There's no 100% guarantee that AI will apply all of these criteria, right? It's non-deterministic and hit and miss, but it gives you like a higher probability that you can help your colleagues with higher quality artifacts. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and so this is like a blueprint that I often use, like when I sit down with people like Andrew, to kind of think about, yeah, it's like user experience design, right? You're designing an assistance experience for your colleagues in this case, right? So you have to think about the user. So the person I want to support, in this case, maybe like a tech lead or an architect, like what are their goals that I assume? What are the personas? What is the input I can expect from them, right? So this is where also the experience comes in. Sometimes for the same type of practice, you might want different types of prompts for different levels of experience, right? So yeah, what input can I expect from them? What would they even know? And then kind of thinking about the practice, like what are good practices here? What are pitfalls? And then usually at this stage, I also think about example inputs so that in the next stage, I can actually have a good representative example that I can test it with and then iterate on when I build the prompt. So that's like the next component here in our blueprint, which is curated, reusable prompt library that you can actually share in your team or across the organization. So there are very lightweight ways to do this, right? Like, for example, on the coders on a team might just have a repository where they put these prompts and then they can point at them with their coding assistant, right? So there's some like more, you know, or you can just put them somewhere and people can copy and paste it over. So there's lightweight ways, but some of these products are also starting to build this in so that you can actually share these prompts across your organization. Like think GPTs or GEMs, or like for those of you who are familiar with those terms. So there's lots of opportunities here, right? And so some of the superpowers of Gen AI that particularly help us in software delivery is like one, that it's really good at translation, right? So translation of requirements to code, code to code, language to queries, standard to standard, right? Another area is finding knowledge, right? These new ways that have been unlocked to do more semantic search. So remembering details and relearning things, understanding errors, providing context, amplifying and socializing knowledge within the team, like with the prompts, brainstorming and ideation I mentioned in the beginning. So to get more comprehensive requirements, more comprehensive testing, as I said, double-edged sword. And then finally, of course, summarization and clustering. So maybe, you know, I've done in the past, for example, fed it with like 500 commit messages, and it would give me like a really good readable change log of those, right? Or when you think about incident management and doing runbooks, right? Maybe based on like past history of conversations and incidents and stuff like that. But there are also some properties of Gen AI to be wary of in software delivery. The number one is, of course, that it's non-deterministic. So don't use it when you need repeatability, for example, in deployment or like the type of automation that you actually want to be repeatable, right? Then large language models think in tokens. They don't think in code, right? So they're not a compiler, even though some people think that's the future. They're not a compiler. They're just not. And just as an example, they cannot do maths by themselves, right? Like you can combine them with tools that can do that, but you have to know these boundaries as a user. They don't know what we don't tell them. So context is key, especially when you're changing something existing. So kind of like brownfield, for lack of a better word. And there's all of this superficial plausibility, right, that trips us up, right? So it generates very plausible outputs, but the devil is in the details, and this can lead to review fatigue, right? So I know of developers who switch off the coding assistant sometimes because they're just tired of reviewing this like very plausible output because it's often not obvious what's wrong with it, right? Yeah, and just to finish, like the blueprint, of course, coding assistants is the last one here as well. And those coding assistants you would also want integrated with those extra knowledge sources. But tools aren't everything, of course, right? So, and tool effectiveness is a function of the people using them and the environment around them, right? The processes, the culture. Like, for example, if you put a lot of pressure on your developers saying you all have to be 50% faster now because after all you have AI, then the tool might actually get less effective because people start cutting corners. And, you know, for just as one example. And software delivery is we're at an agile conference here. It's a collaborative, creative, dynamic team sport, right? And in the hype, people seem to discount once more this reality, right? So there's a resurgence of this software as a factory fallacy. Like you can see it, for example, in a resurgence of the topic, how do we measure things, right? I don't know if you've noticed, I've certainly noticed because I get the question all the time now in this role, but there was like a McKinsey report about measuring teams recently a lot. There's more and more products doing this. And sort of like, how do I measure AI impact? How do I measure team impact? How to evaluate AI effectiveness? Like my first question back is always like, how do you do it today? Because just because we have Gen AI in the toolbox now doesn't change the challenge of how we measure outcomes and how we measure this weird like thing that's not really an assembly line with comparable pieces that we can count, right? And so when people ask how does AI impact team productivity and they want a percentage number, it just doesn't make sense, right? So they're trying to simplify the question. They're trying to find a simple question to replace the complex question, right? There is no X% answer to this, right? So it's a combination of like, how does it improve the developer experience, which is a huge point and probably the only way you can actually measure it, which is asking developers. There's like impact on faster onboarding potentially. I see higher test coverage on a lot of teams because they now write more tests. Can you make feedback loops faster? How does it impact your stability, mean time to restore, code quality? And those quality parts in particular, the jury's still out. Like there are a lot of concerning signs actually that, you know, if we just like do it faster with AI, there might actually be a reckoning a year later because we can't maintain and extend our code anymore. So it's like a big kind of complex picture. And this, I mean, this here is only talking about, are you building the thing right? It's not even talking about, are you building the right thing, right? So you might just be building the wrong thing that doesn't actually give you any value, but just now faster, right? So software creation is not just a chain of artifacts, right? And this seems to be something that a lot of people have reverted back to thinking, to the simplified view, right? So it's not like epic into user stories, into tasks, into code, and then we get money, right? And actually, like the sad thing about that is that Gen AI actually complements our toolbox because it's not great at the repeatable factory stuff, right? Like if we actually want to use it like as a new tool that complements what we already have like quite good automation and all of that, right? So it can actually complement that with the stuff that is more vague that you cannot do with the shell script, right? So we should actually be looking at those things and not at the, you know, not treat it as like 100% automation type of tool. So when it comes to, you know, I was just saying earlier in a train conversation, I don't like these terms like bullish, bearish, right? You bullish on AI, bearish on AI. I'm somewhere in between, which you might say is a cop-out maybe, right? But I really like this post by Michael Feathers recently. He said, AI is nothing and it isn't everything. Discount any opinion of those extremes. So I'm definitely like very excited about this. I use AI all the time, not just because it's my job. There are lots of opportunities, but the hype kind of like blows it all out of proportion, right? So, for example, like when we say you can now build more faster, is that a promise or is it actually a threat, right? So theory of constraints came up in one of the sessions yesterday. And so when you think about this, so I said in the beginning that lots of organizations are for now just using coding assistants and not that much else like systemic, strategically, like in a repeatable way with AI. So, and there are lots of signs that there's higher coding throughput. So organizations saying we have more PRs now, more commits, like PRs are also getting bigger, by the way, right? So we definitely see higher coding throughput. But if you can code faster, can you also fill the backlog faster? Can you review faster? Code review process is already a bottleneck in a lot of organizations. Can you test faster? Can you ship faster? And if you produce more code and more features, can you also manage them all in the future, right? Kind of thinking about, okay, what's actually bringing value? What should we delete? Technical debt is like a challenge in like every single one of our clients that I talk to. And there are now more and more stories kind of like coming up that really relate to this to this issue. For example, Annie Vella is also like a really good person to follow. Like she writes really interesting blog posts about these topics as well. And she had this one in February, the SDLC strikes back. And she was giving some examples like people saying, we start using Cursor now, which is one of the popular coding assistants. Now our designers like can't keep up filling the backlog, right? Or she was talking about this GitHub bug that was caused by one of the rapid application development tools that I talked about before. They created so many repositories in one of the GitHub organizations because so many people were using it to just like randomly do like a quick prototype that GitHub had an outage. So they had to suspend the organization temporarily to recover from that. And this one also, I've been thinking about this blog post like all the time recently. So this is about this author, Galo Navarro, kind of reflecting on what happened in the past in organizations that were actually able to like pick up speed and become like really fast and like deploy hundreds of times a day. So he talks about Slack here, for example. So he basically said the software industry was already competent at increasing supply well before AI, right? There are some of these like organizations at the top of their game who are really good at like high throughput, right? And they had like big struggles on the way there to actually be able to support that. So here the example of Slack is that they had at some point a 10% month-over-month growth in CI/CD requests because they hired more people and you know, there's just more requirements and complexity, and everything kind of slowed down. So even though they had more to put into the pipeline, like the processes and the automation and all of that just couldn't keep up with that. So now just imagine like some of the organizations that you've worked for or that you work with right now and the maturity of their processes and their automation, and they just switch to a higher throughput from one day to the other with AI, right? And then another thing, so when I look at, you know, the agent doing its thing, at some point, sometimes I'm like, wait, what's happening? What is it doing? You know, and then I feel like I kind of lose control and I roll back to an earlier checkpoint where I still felt comfortable. So coding assistants have these checkpoints that you can roll back to. And so recently I've just been wondering, like, what happens once everybody starts using this and you're like a product manager or a delivery manager, and, you know, you kind of take this to a bigger picture and things change all the time around you because everybody's using AI, and you kind of like feel like you lose control. Like what's actually happening? You can't just roll back to an earlier checkpoint, right? So yeah, is more speed, is that a threat or a promise? Also, I mentioned it a few times already, we can generate more options. Is that a blessing or a curse? So Gene Kim has been talking about this a lot, this like new type of value that gets unlocked with Gen AI that he thinks a lot of people underestimate, that you can create more options earlier. And he's also in this blog post also talking about, you know, the history of how like creating more options in the past, also even in the context of microservices architecture and stuff like that, has been like a real like game changer. And I agree with him that this is like really high value, but at the same time, I gave you a few examples before of how more ideas is not always better, right? And so this is Pranja, the designer who works on the Bamni project I mentioned before, and she says that use of AI can easily lead to kind of perpetual divergence rather than convergence. And she has spent a lot of time revisiting design decisions every time a new AI-generated idea comes up. So just as one of the examples here. And then finally, I've also been wondering if we're tempted back into old habits. So because I talked about how AI does such a good job to like give you a lot of details in a plausible way, right? And then, you know, sunk cost fallacy kicks in and we kind of think, oh yeah, but I already have it, so let's just keep it and drag it through all of these stages, right? And so I wonder, will we like are we getting tempted into doing more upfront detailed design, right? Because it can generate these beautiful, plausible, over-detailed requirements. So if I do that very early on, and now I have it, right? So let's just drag it through the next stages. And then once it gets to the actual implementation, things have changed around us, right? Because that's why we do all of these things, that things change all the time. And now we have to edit all of these details that AI generated for us again, right? So it's probably a good practice to like hold off on the details early on, maybe for ideation, but then throw them out and really like create the details with the help of AI as close to the point where we actually need them as possible. And then secondly, I see a lot of kind of like shifting of human quality control to the right again. So like a developer going, oh, my code works. I don't quite understand like what it does, but I'll push it. The reviewer in the pull request review will certainly find it, right? And then I hear like comments from people like, you know, being really angry. It's like, I don't want to review the AI code. I want to review the final result that was created by my colleague, right? And I also see like a lot of like this idea of like having AI in your pipeline help you with the code review or during the pull request review process, where I'm always like, but if there's a script that lets AI review the code, then why doesn't the developer do that before they push, right? So there's a lot of this, oh, we'll just let AI do a lot of this stuff that like kind of like subtly shifts everything to the right again. So in conclusion, who would have thought, once more, it comes down to being prepared for uncertainty and fast pace of change, right? So say agile without saying agile. So we need resilience and responsiveness, especially in this like time of like faster pace of change. So if you actually want that higher throughput, you have to be prepared like to monitor like what's going on and to react to like bugs and all of those things. And we still need fast and reliable feedback loops, right? On all of the levels. Like in coding, when I use a coding assistant, before I start a task, I always have to think about how will I know that it did what I wanted it to do? What is my feedback loop? What is my feedback loop, right? So I don't lose control over what the machine is doing. So I had a lot of cautionary stuff here at the end, but as I said before, I'm also really enthusiastic about this. It's in our toolbox now. It's not going away. There are all of these opportunities like to complement what we already have, but we need to figure out as a profession like how to use this sustainably, and like we need to remember to look at this holistically over the team and not just as like, oh, we can create code faster now. That was never the problem, as we all know, writing more code, right? So to put it in the words of my colleague Scott Shaw, we need 10x teams, not 10x bots. So for those of you who know the meme almost like from years ago, the 10x engineers, you know, where people were talking about, oh, you should only hire engineers that are 10 times as good as other engineers, right? So yeah, we don't want 10x bots, like they're just gonna overrun us. We actually want 10x teams that can get there now, maybe with good use of generative AI. And that's all I have.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I hope that was quite a speed, and I really do hope. Very impressive, thought-provoking. At least I had some few ideas which I want to pursue in the next month or so. That's good. So are there any questions? So we have, yeah, there's lots. Jutta.
Thank you so much. This was just amazing. I wondered about the thing that maybe we are now returning more to waterfall with AI. Okay, this is provocative perhaps, maybe that's not a problem, because what we wanted to solve with XP, Agile, and so on, and I know where I'm speaking right now, so sorry to say that, now everyone hates me, I guess. I just think maybe that need isn't there anymore with AI, because you can have a quick turnaround despite the fact that you are looking deeply into requirements.
Yeah, and that's like in general like a good question to ask with all of these Gen AI things, right? Like for all of these we should like revisit, right? Okay, now that circumstances have changed, we have different tools. Which of these things are actually relevant, or which do we actually want to do differently? And I also thought about that with the like, how does it matter, right? And it's always like, it depends again also on like agile also isn't like always the perfect fit for a project. If you have like very like clearly defined stable environment, maybe you don't need it, right? So I think maybe that trade-off shifts a little bit more. So there's maybe there are going to be more projects where you do that now with AI, but still for the ones that have a lot of like stuff going on and a lot of change and uncertainty, I think there's still that problem that, you know, you prepare this huge backlog with AI because you can. And then, you know, like, I don't know, 3 weeks later, the developer gets to that story and has a lot of details. And in the meantime, things have changed. And now you have to review and edit what you already have, which in my experience is often like more cognitive load and more work than actually like thinking about it again, right? So in those cases, I would still go for story as a placeholder for a conversation that we fill with details once it's like the latest responsible moment. So yeah, as always, it depends, I think. But it's definitely like a really good question to ask for everything now. And I hear people ask like, do we still need tests? You know, stuff like that. Of course, we still need tests, but yeah. So.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if the real power in generative AI is actually in the integrity check, meaning that you can really sort of, like you say, you can test that what you think you have is really what you have. And with that also in suggesting like the adjacent possible, the variations, the options.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it would be a really powerful tool, not for the faster flow, but for the faster change. Because you can really make controlled pivots and repurposing of your code base.
Yeah, I think that's a great use case as well. Like whenever we want to like compare things that are not just like a text tip or something, right? There was a kind of like viral post on Reddit recently where somebody like a very experienced developer who works in the, you know, some kind of graphics domain apparently said, oh, Gen AI just solved my white whale bug that I've been trying to solve for like over 2 years or something like that, where they had done a big redesign of the code base and suddenly this bug appeared. And then he gave Gen AI the old version of the code and the new version of the code, and Gen AI figured out which of the changes actually led to this. So it was just by coincidence that it worked before. And so he was like, okay, that must have felt so good, by the way, right? I hope I had a case like that. But yeah, so these are kind of like complex comparisons, yeah, that kind of slightly related to what you're saying, integrity check, right? Like where you just like try to get pointed, double check. Like you can never 100% rely on that it actually finds all of the things, right? So there's probably things you can apply this with like continuous compliance or something like that. But I don't know if an auditor would say just because an LLM looked at it, you can guarantee that this is good, right? But yeah, there's a lot of potential there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for the very insightful talk. A couple of points that I'd like your opinion on. One is that what's your experience been in terms of how the teams are getting organized? Like one thing that at least I'm noticing in my experience is that a lot of micro-sized teams are able to, kind of have a, considering Gen AI kind of as an extended team member, micro-sized teams, maybe 3, max 4 people combining with AI seem to be kind of working better rather than like relatively like 6, 7 member teams that used to be kind of earlier. And also another point that I'm keen to hear your thoughts is that around blending role boundaries. Like another thing that I'm kind of noticing is that AI kind of working together with it is helping product managers kind of go a bit more downstream, work more collectively with the engineers, kind of collectively prompting or collectively interacting with cursor. And similarly, the engineer is also kind of moving a bit more upstream, where the kind of interpreting code from the aspect of business value. And so, kind of what's your view in terms of the roles being a bit more blended going forward?
Yeah, definitely. Maybe the second one first about the roles. I think pairing between 2 different roles can be a lot more effective now with these tools. And also, like you said, like cross-skilling can potentially be easier when you have things like what I was talking about like amplifying the practices and actually applying it to a situation so you can learn faster. I'm still like holding my breath a little bit that we don't underestimate like actual expertise and actual experience, right? So we might also now think that, I don't know if it's like some form of Dunning-Kruger effect but we might now think, oh yeah, I can do this, right? Like I was doing all of this design stuff, trying these tools, and then I was seeing what my colleague Pranjal was doing, who's an actual professional designer, and I was like, oh, I didn't even think about all of these things, right? So I think that there's definitely potential, but I'm also like, yeah, still kind of like seeing, I think we cannot tell right now like how far this will go because I haven't seen many people like try this out in like an extreme way yet. And then in terms of the team sizes, yeah, I've also been thinking about this a lot with like, I was talking about the speed and I didn't even talk about parallelization, right? Like when you have this type of speed and then you have like 4 pairs all work with AI, crank out these big commits, like, will you get lots of merge conflicts? Will you know, like I said, will you kind of lose control? So it does make sense to me that a team would get smaller also to even like support that. But then at the same time, like, what if that team has to be on call, right? It still needs like a larger size. And then what if you want to keep the large size, but they need more topics so that they can have micro teams, but then you increase the team's cognitive load again. And is that too much, right? So, or also when you like cross-skill everybody with AI, will the cognitive load be too high? You just like do everything kind of superficially, plausibly as a human as well. But does that actually make the quality better, right? Like, so I haven't really seen a lot of like radical changes in team setup other than maybe teams getting smaller. But I imagine it will come, but it has all kinds of like, this means that the team should be smaller. This means it has to stay big. Yeah. So lots of thoughts, not an answer.
Hi. I think you very rightly mentioned. Thank you. Technology. I think you very rightly mentioned we have AI tools like across the board, right? And at least in my experience, what I've seen is there's this over-reliance slowly on especially these tools. Like I can say from personal experience now, every thought I need to have, I need to run it through ChatGPT to frame it properly. Have you actually experienced some of this even with you where you kind of realize that I've lost my individual creative thought process, and kind of how are you tackling this in a world where especially you're kind of assessing all of these tools at all levels?
No, definitely this like mental thing or this, that's definitely real. This kind of like being pulled into complacency all the time as well when you review like with the code, right? Oh, it works, like, and we only feel productive when we're creating things, or at least as a developer, as an engineer, like that's how I've been like socialized, let's say, in the profession, right? Like when I create code, then I'm productive. When I just sit there for 15 minutes reviewing code, that's less productive, right? And also less fun, right? So that you constantly have these like temptations and I mean, or what you said with like, oh, I now always have to go to like ChatGPT and make the phrasing better or something like that, right? And so for the second one, like how I deal with it is that it just, you know, ChatGPT or like whatever AI tool I'm using kind of deals with it, because when I use it for a real thing and it's like not good, then I will actually notice, right? So, and I do notice that it's never just like done, but I try to use it like where it helps me think, right? So, yeah, so it's definitely not used. If you just treat it as a glorified artifact generator, it will not make you happy ultimately because the impact will not be good. So you have to do it. So in that way, it kind of helps that it's not perfect, you know, but I definitely see this like that you get more and more, you feel like you're dependent on it. And it's like, oh, I don't have internet. Like, oh, can I run the local model? Like, you know, there's so many psychological effects happening here with people using this. It's really interesting and also a little bit scary. Yeah.
Over here. Real quick question. I kind of want to piggyback off of that and ask a bit of a doomsday question, if you're okay with this.
Yeah.
Do you think that AI could potentially hold the promise of making development not fulfilling anymore?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, and that's really like, I really like that one of the delivery managers in ThoughtWorks, when I was in a conversation where she first heard about the agentic modes and what it does, and she was like, "Oh, but will developers still like this? You know, with this?" It's like, yes, exactly. You know, so yeah, I think it's like, I mean, coding is like playing a computer game, right? You get all the dopamine hits, the green tests, the like, oh my God, I built this from scratch and it's working, right? I think we'll keep some of that because we're still building stuff, right? And you actually get like a new type of fulfillment from the speed, and that you don't have to deal with some of the nitty gritty anymore, which is also not always the fulfilling stuff, right? So I think there's arguments for both sides. yeah, I don't like the doomsday scenario that I have in mind. If you're interested in that, it's more like we're already sitting on a mountain of SHIT in terms of software, and we're more and more dependent on it as society, as like everything, right? And like everybody has technical debt, whatever that means. Everybody has product debt as well, even though some companies maybe don't see it. But me as a consumer, I definitely feel like in the last 5 years or so, everything has somehow either not gotten better or worse, right? Or like, I don't know if some of you are familiar with the enshittification of platforms, the Cory Doctorow thing, right? And so we're sitting on this mountain, and now, like, what if we just double that mountain in the next 5 years at a time when we haven't even figured out how to use these tools? So that's kind of like a pretty plausible scenario for me. So, and yeah, so the key is kind of like, I think for organizations, like, can they use Gen AI to reduce the debt and actually make things better, or do they use it to just like amplify everything? So that's more my big picture doomsday. I hope that building software will still be fun. I really hope so.
So could AI be used to reverse engineer the code and produce data flow diagrams, for example, in a
absolutely, yeah. Yeah. We use it a lot in like legacy modernization and displacement projects. So for example, COBOL replacements, right? So a lot of the time spent in these modernization projects is often the reverse engineering of describing what does the current module do, right? And so we've done, for example, stuff like load the COBOL code and other kind of like ancillary information into a knowledge graph, and then use that to generate that and kind of like cut the time of doing that reverse engineering from 4 weeks into like a few days, and then work with the subject matter expert. Or I've recently also done experiments where I've used that thing that you saw in the beginning where AI browses through an application to go like browse through an application and actually create a description of an application, because we have a client right now who's lost the code for an application and they've been unable to replace it, right? So we've been kind of trying to think about, okay, if we don't have the code, which sometimes is a good thing because code is often very messy, like how can you use AI to help you with this description and then have a human edit it and then use it for the forward engineering? So yeah, that's like a really good use case for it.